Welcome to the Signal Drop, where we discuss all things telecoms. Whether you're a newbie, a nerd, or anything in between, this podcast is for you.
So over the course of this podcast, you'll hear from the Empirical trainers imparting their knowledge, you'll hear from the Empirical team, and from time to time, we'll even bring in the odd guest speaker.
Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Signal Drop. We are in the studio today with myself, Morgan. I'm the marketing manager. We've got Gavin. Say hello, Gavin.
Hello.
We've got Kev, one of our trainers.
Hello.
And another one of our trainers, Phil.
Hello.
Today we have a very exciting topic in store for you, something that we promised we'd discuss last time. We will be talking about private 5G today. Ooh, thank you, Kev, for the enthusiasm. So obviously we've been hearing a lot in the news about private 5G. Kev, do you want to tell us what all the fuss is about?
That's a very enthusiastic introduction.
We are the only enthusiastic people
absolutely.
in this room. I can
although it
sense
doesn't sound like it from my voice. Sorry. Great question. And obviously it makes sense at the outset to talk about, how we define private 5G and indeed private cellular networks. So ultimately, if we take the example of the public network, most people are familiar with a public 5G network. Well, we're simply applying that at a smaller scale. And this is in scenarios that would require wireless communication, so things such as container ports, things such as agricultural settings, industrial settings. So anywhere really that has a requirement for wireless connectivity.
It's sometimes it's actually organisations that have got fixed connectivity and they want to move to a wireless solution, but Wi-Fi is not the best solution for them. And it's only more recently that we are starting to see more kind of cellular-based private networking solutions. And, we talk about private 5G a great deal because that's all over the press. But in reality, there's a lot more private LTE or private 4G out there than there is private 5G in actual commercial use cases.
It's also worth pointing out that the cellular private networks obviously come with some key advantages over Wi-Fi, and that is typically the spectrum that you've got access to, which typically also means bigger cells, more interworking with the traditional public networks. So it's not just a case of a private 5G network standing by itself, it's about integrating with the wider public networks in some cases as well.
I think there is this compulsion to kind of have 5G and Wi-Fi competing with one another. Everyone's always trying to say, well, what's the advantages of one over the other and such like. But the reality is you're going to use the right technology for the situation. And in a lot of private wireless solutions, Wi-Fi could well be the best technology. But for others, particularly when we're looking at kind of wide area private networks, so a container port is a good example, then Wi-Fi doesn't hold up as well as cellular technologies. And I guess with cellular, cellular from the outset was always designed as a wide area technology, whereas Wi-Fi was always designed as a local area technology. But on top of that, with cellular, you've got all kinds of kind of additional features to do with end device management, subscriber management, quality of service management, all of these different features that are not as readily available in Wi-Fi, I guess.
Yeah, you have to think Wi-Fi is really just a peer-to-peer solution, whereas cellular networks can incorporate voice, for example, as part of sort of voice over LTE, voice over new radio. Yeah. And Wi-Fi would have to bolt on another service to get that.
And in fact, anything that you see in kind of standard 5G, network slicing, URLC, all these different bits and pieces, they can just as readily be available in a private 5G solution as a public one. And again, there's just more features that 5G has over Wi-Fi.
So you could say 4G as well. So,
and 4G as well.
But I'd say the good thing is, it's not a mutually exclusive world. You could actually have a hybrid system anyway.
Yeah, well, Wi-Fi integrates with LTE and 5G anyway, doesn't it?
Exactly. So, it's getting the right fit based on the devices, based on the services.
I think another point to pick up on as well is the fact that Wi-Fi operates in the ISM bands, the industrial, scientific and medical bands, as do lots of other devices. So I think there is a question of interference there as well, which you wouldn't necessarily be the case with a cellular network, for example. So in things such as sensitive industrial control systems, there may be a requirement for a more robust solution that is more resistant to interference than Wi-Fi, for example. So, there's technologies that are available in private 5G, so time-sensitive networking, for example, that previously might only have been available via Ethernet, via a wired solution. So, I certainly think there are lots of elements where 5G or indeed 4G is a better solution than Wi-Fi in an environment where wireless connectivity is required.
That's the big one, isn't it? It's interference because of the ISM band. You're competing with so many different technologies, whereas with cellular, you've got the option of using a more exclusive frequency, shall we say. Do you have any questions, by the way, Morgan?
I've been sitting here listening.
I've
been sitting here zoning out on your ISM bands and trying to think of a nice segue, but I can't, only because I want to get my little 2 cents in, which is around use cases and applications for 5G, private 5G. I wrote a blog a couple years ago, Gav. I don't know if you recall. It was when we were releasing some new courses on 5G use cases. And in this blog, I ran through some various ones, including one around the use of 5G or IoT devices to sit on cow tails. Yeah, so this is obviously a use
As
case.
in the tail of a cow.
A tail of a cow,
Okay.
Gavin. That is exactly what I meant. I know you weren't expecting to talk about cow tails today, but alas, here we are. So they put the device on the cow tails, and apparently before a cow is about to give birth, their tail wags faster, and it alerts the farmer. So I thought that was really cool. I don't know if anybody else thinks it's cool, but obviously we've got shipping containers, we've got logistics, we've got other ways it can be used in agriculture. Don't they have something around using it in the soil to monitor seed development?
You've got things. I mean, we're kind of blending two concepts here, because one of these is IoT and one of them is private 5G, and they can complement each other, but things like sensors in the soil to measure acidity or to measure moisture levels, that doesn't need to rely on a private 5G network. You could have that running over a public 5G network just as easily. It just depends on what you need for your particular use case, and well, ultimately cost is a big factor as well. Which it does lead on to the question of, well, how do you actually deploy a private 5G network? What are the options for what the architecture will look like?
Yeah, so when it comes to deploying, I've got a couple of options, but at the end of the day, it can be done relatively cheaply, especially if you're using cloud-based 4G, 5G systems. You still need the base stations, and that's the sort of the finite, sort of limited resource with respect to you have to have base stations and you have to have radio spectrum. Now there's different ways of getting that radio spectrum. You could get it from the regulator. You might have the ability to have shared spectrum, where the same spectrum could be used based on geographical location. So one farm could use a spectrum, the next farm a different spectrum, the next farm reusing the first one. There's those scenarios, and it's quite cheap actually. You can do things like local spectrum allocation. So it's on a first come first served basis in most countries. That the idea is you might say, right, I want to do a private 5G network here, and I need this much bandwidth for my service, and you typically pay an annual fee per band, and also more bandwidth means more megabits per second for that particular service. So that's one way of getting some resources. Then it is the architecture. Is it everything else myself? I'm going to one of the big vendors and I'm buying all that equipment, and there's a cost there. Or you might find the service providers in country are offering private 5G services, so you might be able to sit on the back of them.
Yeah, so a good example there is AWS. They've, I think it was sometime last year, started to offer what is effectively a turnkey private 5G solution, where they'll provide all of the equipment. They will lease the radio equipment, and you will essentially pay for what you use in the same way, as their other clouds services would be billed. So that is an option, and we are starting to see that in different countries where we do have that availability and that affordability of spectrum. Well, this is a service that can be deployed that can actually provide all of the equipment that's required for a single monthly fee, which I think makes it a much more compelling proposition than perhaps some of the other applications of private 5G that we've seen. Because if you're a small farmer, for example, if you do have a requirement for this kind of connectivity across the farm, then chances are you will have looked at simpler, cheaper solutions already. And I think in order to make a compelling case for 5G, we need to see these sorts of implementations that, the barrier of entry, the cost of entry is reduced, the complexity in terms of deployment is reduced, because, of course, Wi-Fi itself is a much less complex technology to deploy. Most of us have got it in our houses. So, yeah, I think when it comes to making a case for private 5G, I think this is where these sorts of solutions will come in.
I guess when you talk about architecture, that approach, the AWS approach, is an example of what's called if we look at it from the kind of standards perspective, you'd call it a standalone non-public network, which is a good point, actually. The 3GPP don't use the term private 5G, they use the term non-public network. So that's standalone NPN. But you can go right to the other end of the scale, where basically the kind of owner of the 5G network doesn't have any infrastructure, which is what Phil was alluding to. And actually a full solution can be delivered by a mobile operator. They don't even need to have their own RAN infrastructure. They can just borrow infrastructure from the mobile operator. That's the other end of the scale. It's called a public network integrated non-public network. And you can do that using network slicing. So the way that you buy a private 5G solution is you go to an operator and you buy a network slice, and you literally don't have anything on premises potentially.
Yeah, I think the key thing about the architecture will be the end devices.
Yeah.
Based on the use case, what is the end devices? Is it smartphones, or is it something else? If it's in an industrial environment, you might want these modems devices built into existing equipment, bolted on, possibly replacing a Wi-Fi solution or a wired solution. So I think that's where the cost will come, not from potentially just the implementation of the private 4G, private 5G. It might be the integration of the solution into the existing systems that you might have, again, if you've got them, that is.
I think a good point to make as well is that this is, this integration with public networks will be dependent on coverage. And of course, we may see private 5G mooted as an option for more hostile environments, things such as subterranean mines, for example, where, a public operator wouldn't necessarily be able to provide that coverage. And actually a private 5G solution may be something that's implemented on site in an area where there isn't any public network coverage at all.
Yeah, mines are interesting because basically when you're that far underground, you can use any frequencies that you want, because you won't be interfering with any.
I thought you were going to say nobody can hear you scream.
I suppose the other thing about mines is, it doesn't matter about the spectrum either. I know you just said about interference, but typically, it's quite a small system of relaying communications, in which case it doesn't need a lot. So it's not like we're downloading 4K video or something like that, as you would expect from like 5G solutions. It's very small communications, typically sensors and voice potentially.
I think, taking a bit of a step back, remember what these private 5G networks are there to do. They are there to allow, a server to communicate with a client of some description in whatever scenario. So 5G is just providing the transmission medium to allow that communication to take place. And that doesn't mean to say that you need to have kit on site. As long as you've got the radio coverage, as long as you can get the traffic from A to B using that radio network, then you don't need to have any infrastructure, or you could go completely in the opposite direction and have a full solution on site, which is probably what you'd have with an underground mine.
So is price the biggest limitation to a private 5G network deployment?
Private 5G is expensive because it's the latest technology, but remember, there's still loads of private LTE out there, but generally speaking, private LTE isn't as capable as private 5G. One of the big restrictions is spectrum. You need some radio spectrum in which to operate. We don't really want to use unlicensed spectrum because Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and everything else uses that. licensed spectrum is often too expensive. I say it often, but there are some private network providers that can offer licensed spectrum. So the biggest one to go for is shared spectrum, which is what Phil was talking about earlier. You know, Ofcom in the UK has got two kinds of licenses. One of them is just a pure shared license where you can pay a pretty small amount of money for a 100 meg channel. And it is shared, so there is a risk of interference, but then Ofcom kind of regulate the use of that spectrum so you can't transmit at particularly high power and such like, and you've got to register where you will be using that spectrum. But then there's another kind of license that Ofcom offers where if you're in a remote location like a mine or an open cast quarry or something like that, but if you don't see any signals from cellular operators, then you can actually use their frequencies as long as there's absolutely no risk of you interfering with them. Ofcom will allow you to use their frequencies. And similar initiatives are taking place all over the world in terms of trying to free up shared spectrum. That's the key for private wireless. It's shared spectrum.
Yeah, if you make that cost effective, then it makes the end solution a cost effective solution, and obviously having limited interference means that the quality of those connections are up there.
It is shared. I mean, shared spectrum does have its problems because, you know, in the States where a lot of private LTE and private 5G is based on the CBRS band, which is the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, well, that band is shared with the US Navy. So there's scenarios where if you're near a Navy ship or a naval base...
The coast.
Yeah, the coast, basically. Yeah, you need spectrum brokering to take place to make sure that you're not going to interfere with.
It's almost like as a ship goes past, you have to stop transmitting, which doesn't help for your private 5G solution.
Mission critical system.
Is it possible to steal spectrum? Can people do that?
Well, you can illegally, yes.
Well, yeah.
We'll demonstrate that later. No,
we can't endorse that in this podcast.
It is,
just as a disclaimer.
It is well regulated.
The idea is within every country you have regulators that look around for people illegally using spectrum. So typically they could use it, but if no one detects them, you wouldn't know about it. So it's only when, for example, one private 5G network might be saying, "Well, I'm getting lots of interference on my channels," and then they might start investigating where that interference is coming from, using what they call direction finding kit to go, "Oh, it's coming from over here," and they could find possibly an illegal transmitter.
The regulator special forces will swoop in and
knock the door down.
Take out the infrastructure. Yeah, I think another area to consider though, which can be overlooked, is actual knowledge about these solutions, which is a limiting factor for private wireless, because if you think about how much Wi-Fi is out there, I mean, everyone's got Wi-Fi in their own house. There's a lot of Wi-Fi out there. There's a lot of knowledge on Wi-Fi, but if you compare that to 4G or 5G, you know, these are very niche areas. So your typical IT department who might be responsible for running a Wi-Fi infrastructure will probably need to gain quite a lot of knowledge to understand how to manage an equivalent 4G or 5G infrastructure, which probably isn't that realistic. In a lot of cases, you would need to outsource that to your private network provider, which is why maybe using a network slice from a public operator is quite appealing to, you know, a small outfit that need a private 5G network, but obviously they don't want the hassle of managing it.
And I think that's why we see these in a box solutions. So I've mentioned AWS already, but I did chat to a representative from Microsoft. Other companies are available, who was discussing their private 5G solution for oil rigs. And this came in a box. This box was transportable. Indeed, it was on display at MWC. And it was very much a case, if you open this box up, you plug things in, and in theory, things start to work. Now, if you're on an oil rig, if things start to go wrong, I guess it's a bit more problematic. But this was an out-of-the-box solution that could be deployed within minutes to provide cellular connectivity. So, yes, these solutions can be extremely complex, but what we are starting to see is this kind of reduction of complexity. I'm not really sure what the term you would use to describe it is. This kind of boxing up these turnkey type solutions. But I think another key thing to mention is we're seeing a lot of test beds and pilot projects, but in terms of real world actual deployments, I think this is an area where we'd have to say this is still very much in its infancy. And I think that's why we encounter the problems with Spectrum as well. I think this is a case of the technology has come along, but then we've actually realised, well, in order to make this work, we need to be allowing a lot more people to use Spectrum, which in itself is a very kind of precious commodity. So, these are some challenges. And I think as a technology, it's very much in its early days, and, and it remains to be seen how it will develop in terms of commercial scenarios outside of these pilot projects and these test beds.
I think there's also the education side, linking to the end consumers or the people that want the private 5G network. They might not realise that they need a private 5G network. They may have already an incumbent system that's working perfectly fine, and they don't realise that it can be better. And it's not until somebody comes along and say, we've got this solution and it's going to cost this much and we can do this. And that might be like a turnkey private 5G network provider, effectively, that comes along and says, right, we've got this solution that works great on farms or works great in oil rigs. Let's now go and contact everybody who's got an oil rig or a farm or a port or an underground mining facility.
I think part of the issue is that the marketing engine for private 5G has well and truly started turning the wheels, and that's the difficulty. There is a plethora of different use cases and examples that are out there, but a lot of them are proof of concepts. It is taking time.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is really, how do we define the value proposition for private 5G? We've talked about how it can be used to replace existing systems, and I think it's when will people feel compelled enough that 5G offers a compelling solution? Because one thing that we haven't actually mentioned, though it was mentioned in passing, is the kind of granularity, the level of control that we get with 5G. And as Phil's just mentioned, I think it's a case of highlighting what we can do with 5G, and use cases may arise where we say, well, actually 5G or private 5G is the perfect solution for this scenario.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, going back to Kev, your little your discussion with us on the out-of-the-box solution, which literally sounded like it was a bit of kit in a box. What would be required in that box in terms of the equipment in that scenario? Coming from, obviously, a very non-technical person, some radio towers.
Well, you can buy kind of private 5G solutions that'll come with a kind of a core network in a box. And when we talk about core network in a box, we mean, we're using commercial off-the-shelf processing capability here. It's still a cloud-based solution, just like a big public operator's core network would be. It's just obviously on a smaller scale. So it'd be a cloud-native core solution, and there will be a handful of base stations which will be dictated by the area that you need to coverage, the radio spectrum that you've got available to you, and such like.
And in that scenario as well, with the oil rig, you may need some form of backhaul, some form of connectivity, onward, possibly into a public network, possibly onto the internet or some other data network, because presumably in that solution, the oil rig was not just using it for connectivity on the rig itself, it was needing to perhaps communicate various metrics, back to some sort of server that's based on land, or perhaps allowing connectivity for the rig workers themselves. So, in addition to the radio kit that's required on the rig, there will be some form of backhaul, whether that's, microwave, satellite, maybe even 5G itself that can be used.
Okay. And because we're approaching the end of the podcast today, we kind of started a tradition last time, didn't we, where we do a bit of a around the room, take a poll of what everybody thinks on a particular topic. So the question today is, what do we think will be the most popular use case for private 5G networks? Starting with you, Gavin.
I don't necessarily think this will be the most popular, but the one I'm quite interested in is healthcare. I've seen quite a few examples where private 5G is used in a healthcare setting. First of all, because some hospitals are quite old, so it can be too expensive to put Ethernet in there or rip out the Ethernet, replace Ethernet. Wi-Fi isn't necessarily the best solution. So there's quite a few examples of 5G being used in a healthcare environment. Obviously, with the latest imagery that gets taken of people's body parts, etc., that information is quite large volumes of data, and it needs to be transmitted around the hospital quickly to different consultants, etc. Particularly, 5G's influence in emergency situations as well. covering. There's been examples of kind of 5G connected ambulances able to communicate back to the emergency room to give consultants forward warning of injuries and things like that. And I guess that's going to be a blend of possibly public and private 5G, but I think that's quite an interesting area for me to consider.
Okay, so I guess I'm next. Yeah, I think for me, from some of the things that I've seen, I would have to say kind of industry. I had the privilege of visiting an industrial site that was utilising private 5G as a solution. And it was a kind of additive manufacturing facility, and it was really great to see the different ways that private 5G was being used and the different elements, I guess, of 5G that were being utilised there. You know, we've got the element of low latency communication, but also within industry, we can incorporate things such as time-sensitive networking, deterministic networking. So all of these things are actually, you know, required in many industrial settings. And, you know, the fact that private 5G is able to support that, it's easy to deploy, as Gav alluded to. You know, we're not putting wires all over the factory floor. We can easily set up wireless communication using 5G. We can utilise the benefits of 5G as a technology across different scenarios. And so I think industry really is quite an all-encompassing term that covers lots and lots of different use cases. But you can really see that across one particular building or across a manufacturing site, the benefits of having that unified connectivity that gives you that granular control that you have with a private 5G network.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I was just thinking about industry. That might even go on to things like smart cities as well. You know, are they going to be a public or private enterprise when they get deployed? Yeah. In terms of my sort of idea of private 5G networks and what's going to be most popular, I've probably got two actually. One would be linking into ports, and I suppose that's a bit of a get out. Because
hang on a second, Phil. Is this just not an opportunity for you to start talking about the QE2 again?
I'm not talking about that at all.
Okay.
Nothing to do with Southampton and New York. So in terms of, we've already seen actual deployments of private 5G in ports, and therefore, you know, the fact that that's already happening, and given that how many ports there are in the world, that is going to be a massive undertaking anyway. So that's definitely a tracking of containers, surveillance, ship monitoring, utilising drones, utilising AI communication, AI sort of monitoring type mechanisms as well. And then the other one I would say would be linking into mining. Again, communications underground. It is a challenge, and we're already seeing quite a lot of interest from private 5G networks going into these mining, again to do with communications, sensors, monitoring, and being able to relay that back to the surface effectively.
Oh, you gonna ask me?
Cool.
Well, obviously agriculture, so that I can talk more about those cowtails. No, really, that's all I've got. I just thought it was interesting. So that's a good note to end on. With that said, thank you, everybody. And we hope you stay tuned because we'll be releasing the final episode of our first series of this podcast, The Signal Drop. And we hope you've enjoyed so far. And we look forward to welcoming you next time.
Next podcast is all around security, and there's a rather interesting quiz challenge that we've been putting together.
Yeah, I can't wait to do that, and you'll have to stay tuned and tune in next time to find out more about that. It would help if you know about cybersecurity and 80s bands, which I appreciate is quite a strange Venn diagram, but see how we get on next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.